Hi, friends. Host Eric here with a room full of intellect to discuss the following very interesting topic. The title will be something evocative like How Evolution Fail Proves Reality a Simulation. Something like that. It doesn't really prove it, but it seems to suggest it. So I was chatting with Luna and somebody else, I don't remember who exactly, earlier today about evolution and how it doesn't make any sense, which it doesn't. And I said, well, if you want to convince me otherwise, shoot me a link indicating that you can definitively determine instances of speciation, especially ones that humans have caused. Because if in fact the natural selection model is accurate, we should be able to cause speciation by differentiating within a species. But we can't and haven't yet. Now, Luna, being incredibly brilliant, found some pretty decent evidence on speciation and sent it to me, which included lots of instances of it. The problem is the iffiness of the whole thing was such that all I ended up feeling was not that speciation had been proven, but rather like, is that the best they can do? And the examples they were using either stemmed from hybridization or isolated mutants within a stable population. So it wasn't like an adaptive change, and it wouldn't make any sense that the species would evolve into these adaptive changes based on responses to the ecosystem, even in geographical isolation. Plus, the time frame's not enough to allow for evolution to actually work. What it does make perfect sense with, though, however, is a game where you start by making a species, and you can't impact the things in the game in the simulation directly, but you can do things in the simulation that you can anticipate will have certain kinds of impacts. So if you imagine the game beginning with people starting making species, obviously if it's sort of a competitive endeavor in which species making, you either successful or fail at it based on the success or failure of the species, then they can't have species turning into other species because that would mess up the mechanics of the game. But they need to have adaptability. Species need to be able to change a little bit, at least in response to circumstances in their environment. So they are able to change in terms of the, like, you can get hybrid species, you can get species that have wide variety within them, but actual speciation doesn't ever really occur. And when it does, or seems to, it almost always leads to not reproductively viable, uh, not reproductively
Offspring.
viable offspring. Right. So as a consequence, what I'm saying is, in what context would that make the most sense? It makes perfect sense as a simulation game, but it doesn't make really any sense as a reality because why would how would all the species get? I mean, evolution doesn't explain how all the species got here because it doesn't explain speciation at all. And there's no possible way it makes any sense that a 1,000-year-old tree could develop the trait of 1,000-year-oldedness through many, many generations when you're not even talking more than 4 billion years. So the Earth has been around. That's not enough time. A 1,000-year-old tree, it's only 1,000 instances of that to get to a million years. And if you think about the amount of change that occurs over time, like for example, humans have been around for 25,000 years, and the evolutionary development in terms of physical evolution is extraordinarily minor. Little things like rolling your tongue, maybe. So if that takes 25,000 years to get from flat tongue to rolling tongue, how can we possibly think we're going to get um, to from single cell to human being in a couple billion years? It just doesn't make any sense at all. It's not sustainable. But it does make perfect sense if it were the rules of a game because that makes sense. Why you'd have to lock off species like that, you know? And then maybe the ultimate goal of the game is for the 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 sim creatures to be able to create a sim of equivalency. You know, so it's like once the sim creatures can create a sim that's equivalently deep as the one that we're in, then you've won the game. That's just a theory. Could be any number of different victory metrics, but I would suggest that the abject failure of evolution to substantiate itself through any sort of empirics. I don't mind that it was an intuitive idea first, but it just doesn't really hold much water as an intuitive idea either. Most good intuitive ideas are always proven with empirics within some amount of time, and all good ideas are intuitive first. So it's like, you know, Einstein's various theories have been proven by empirics. He didn't have any empirics on it when he first came up with them. Darwin's is not proved by empirics. It is some empirics that seem to be consistent with it, and lots of empirics that are inconsistent with it, and it really doesn't make any sense. So, anyway, that's my reasoning for why it's a sim, because it does make perfect sense as a sim. Thoughts?
Okay. Well, how would you be able to determine the difference between a simulation and a natural system, because at the end of the day, each system would be based upon some form of algorithm. So even if speciation exists, it will be existing within some kind of paradigm or sets of rules. So if, for example, it wouldn't just happen in a random, or maybe even the determination of what random means would have to be uh, elucidated. But randomness, or the quality of randomness, or this whole kind of infinite potentiality for one species to evolve in a subset of manner, in a myriad of ways in which it becomes more adapted to a specific environmental stimuli, will still be predicated upon what rules it's being based upon. So I'm not really sure if the distinction between simulation and this Darwinian Darwinian concept is meaningful,
Well,
because
okay, let me answer some of what you just said because it's an important distinction you're making. I agree that if it's an effective enough simulation, there's no way of determining it for sure. Probably, certainly not right now. But there would be indications that would be consistent with simulation or inconsistent with the simulation as we understand them. So, for example, if we were in a simulation, when we push too hard at the boundaries of the engine, we get weird bugs like quantum
yeah,
mechanics. You know,
yes,
if we were in a sim, we'd have what appears to be a whole bunch of species that have evolved, but no evolution mechanism that makes any sense because they're not actually evolved, right? They've been placed here by the early players of the game, the early adopters. Once intelligent life got developed as a species, then and you think about it, it's like if you're a player in this massively multiplayer game and you're saying, okay, well, I want to make a species that fits a niche. You can fit them in any niche you want, and you go, okay, well, I want to. Oh, look, somebody came up with intelligence now, so I'm gonna come up with a dog, and then all of a sudden you got dogs, right? Now that makes less sense scientifically in some sense than dogs evolved from wolves, but it makes more sense according to the empirics because the evolutionary model is so inadequate that it's got to be something else.
Well, this all smells a lot like it's the watchmaker argument, except instead of God, you're replacing it with simulation.
It's not
And
though.
you're not really defining simulation because everything that we call a simulation or a game is based on what we call reality
Okay,
in
well that's
some
fine.
way.
The second
And
point's fine. The first one is not true. It's not a watchmaker's fallacy.
pardon?
well, okay.
It smells a lot like it to me because like you're just you're saying simulation. You're not really defining
Yeah,
simulation.
but
Yeah, Eric, simulation is a word you might want to avoid because it
okay,
has a lot
fine,
of baggage.
fine. But the point is, the reason it's not a watchmaker's fallacy is the watchmaker's fallacy says that because you see something with complexity, that complexity must have been intended. In other words, well, there's no way that obviously we have an excellent central controlling distribution mechanism because otherwise, how would all these businesses get the stuff they need to run business, on time when they need it? Well, because they're each dealing with it independently. There's no just because a system works doesn't mean somebody designed it. I'm not saying somebody designed. I'm not saying the reason we should believe it's a sim is because the system works or therefore somebody designed it. I'm saying that the reason we ought lean towards design rather than natural occurrence is because if we're natural occurrence, we'd probably be able to come up with some mechanism to explain it.
Well, again, I do believe that you're just using the same argumentation. You say design. Again, please define what you're saying.
Okay, sure. For example, if this were a simulation, the difference between a simulation and a reality would
Can
be
you define simulation?
I'm okay. I was busy trying to define design, but a simulation would be something that is a system created in order to allow the processes to run
So
with some impact. But it's designed to run processes that represent um,
yeah.
processes that occur in other fashions or something. I don't know. It's an
Okay, so
abstract representation of reality. It's a metaphysical
okay,
time object.
okay. So is a simulation something that's intended, and I suppose the Darwinian concept is something that happen is as opposed to intended, but is
Well,
that
Darwinian
the
evolution requires randomness, right? It says there's random mutations that are responsible for everything, ultimately. And a simulation says that if there's randomness, it's been put there for a reason. So I guess intentionality is critical in the notion of distinguishing between a simulation and a non-simulated reality. That it must be intended to be a simulation. So definitionally, then, you'd be correct in that claiming intentionality links in some fashion to a watchmaker's fallacy, but I'm not claiming that the reason we can conclude intentionality is because of indications of design. I'm saying the reason we ought lean towards intentionality is because of the absence of indications of a lack of design.
So it's an argument from ignorance.
No, well, sort of. I mean, it's saying that, as always with any theory, they're either validated or invalidated because they ultimately end up making sense and being consistent with data and all sorts of reasoning and stuff like that, or they ultimately end up being inconsistent. So what I'm saying is, if you look at the holistic data on evolution, for example, it's inconsistent with the explanation. And that's the best explanation humanity's come up with yet for where we all came from. So as a consequence, I'm just saying, given the fact that we don't have complete data, we'd be better off making the mistake of concluding simulation than making the mistake of concluding evolution.
What is the extent of your research into evolution?
What difference does it make? I made my argument.
Well, you just made a claim about the evidence presented, for evolution, and I'm just wondering what the extent of your.
Well, what's prompting this particular conversation is a paper I read this morning that Luna sent me that purported to prove speciation, but when I read it pretty carefully and it was fairly extensive. What I took away from it is.
But you're making overall claims about it.
Okay,
Okay,
that's fine, Casual. But the point is, if you want to negate those claims and those arguments. Don't ask whether I'm expert in it.
No, Eric. No, that's not how it works. Firstly, you have to know. I have to believe that you have looked into it to any extent.
I'm not asking you to believe
what I'm getting from you is that you're not really an expert in the field, and you can't go around making big judgments like that.
But I'm not asking you to believe. I'm not asking you to believe anything. I'm saying, if you wish to dispute anything that I've said, dispute the thing I said. And calling me not an expert doesn't dispute anything I said.
No, I don't have to do that. I just have to know whether or not you know what you're talking about.
Right,
and if
Castro, you don't have to do anything.
So I don't have to listen to what you're saying.
You're right. I'm not trying to force you to believe anything. I'm making arguments. So if you don't want to believe them, fine. I don't give a fuck. I'm not saying you should agree with me. I'm saying if you want to dispute the arguments...
I'm just trying to know whether I should give what you're saying.
You shouldn't, because I'm not an expert enough, so you should just turn off my sound or something. It's fine. Okay. So regardless of the expertise...
No, that's not to say. You're making very specific claims about evolution.
So dispute them specifically.
Well, no, because they're very broad.
Okay, so you don't want to have this conversation. That's fine. I'm not saying you have to or you should.
No, I just want to know whether you've actually looked into it to any large degree, and the answer is no. Okay, carry on.
Yeah, that's fine. I don't claim to be an expert on evolution. I claim to be making specific arguments about evolution, and anybody who wishes to dispute them is encouraged and welcome to do so. However, my expertise level is not a way to dispute any of my specific arguments. Therefore, it's not of interest to me anyway, because it's not facilitating the conversation.
Well, why would we dispute it with you if your expertise level is non-existent?
Well, because if a hobo says, I think that's a big pile of gold right there, if it is gold, even though he's a hobo, you should probably go pick it up.
Well, I mean, I can determine whether I'm looking at gold or not.
Okay. And if you're not, you'll say something like, the reason that's not gold is
iron. There's no argument there, is there?
No, absolutely not. And, the good thing is, if I were to falsely claim something was gold, you'd be able to point out why it's false. Like, that's not gold, it's not heavy enough, it's not the right color, it's wood. So that's why it's important for us to respond to specific arguments.
No, if it wasn't gold, I'd just walk off if a hobo was talking to me, which I'm...
Okay, you're welcome to do that. I'm not encouraging you to continue this line of argumentation, but if you want to, go ahead. I'm not going to preclude it either.
Interesting. So, Eric, well, you have one good point, I suppose, which is the fallacy. Well, I don't want to use the word fallacy because it's often thrown out there, but you are right in one sense that a lot of evolution arguments stem from correlation and then they assume causation. So they see a certain so-called missing link species and then they somehow correlate that, but not in a correlatory manner. Saying that okay, it seems apparent that that species that seems to be somewhat in the middle between these two species is somehow the middle ground between those two species. That's not logically true necessarily. It only appears that they look similar.
It is, the fossil record is consistent with the status quo understanding of evolution. It's understandable why someone would conclude, seeing things branch back to fewer and fewer branches, that things evolved from simpler forms. It is a perfectly reasonable, intuitive conclusion to draw. My argument is that it's wrong.
Oh, okay. But yeah, I mean, yeah. Again, it's a huge correlatory argument, but you can't really. Okay, for example, if you see 20, if there are 20 matchsticks and each are of varying different sizes, you can't assume that one matchstick became the other matchstick, or that the matchstick just kept getting shorter and shorter through time. It seems apparent that way, perhaps, if you look at it from that perspective. But as far as you can conclude is all matchsticks existed at some point in time. That's the only thing you can really conclude. And the moment you try to make any extrapolations from false starting points, then that's when the logic starts to get false, if that makes sense.
Well, I mean, the thing is, my main point is this: that if you crunch the numbers, if you think about it, that how is it that living 1,000 years, for example, as a big tree is, how is that a trait that's selected for?
Well, I suppose it's not necessarily. And okay, maybe Kestrel has a point in terms of your TE. It hasn't been as informed. So, for example, I think most people think somehow evolution is simply this is a trait that was most advantageous, therefore it got carried onwards. But it's partly that, but it's also partly to do with
four mechanisms.
Mutation. So random mutation
there's
that
four
just
mechanisms.
seems.
There's mutations within a population. There's hybridization. There's something called like polygonization, which is like hybridization, and then but it's for asexual reproduction. And then the fourth one is isolation. The one I'm really attacking is the isolation modality. The hybridization one, fine, I accept that, but it doesn't really explain new speciation. It explains why species will blend and merge into a bunch of different phenotypic expressions of themselves. And the asexual one, let's leave that one aside because it complicates things unnecessarily. And then the other one, the idea that a new species might emerge from an existing species, not as an adaptive measure, but simply as a random mutation in which they suddenly have a slightly different chromosomal arrangement, and that makes them a different species. I'll buy that. It's happened. I agree with that. That has happened, but that doesn't explain evolution. That's not, and it certainly isn't the common understanding of it. So that's, it's like I am aware that there are four different mechanisms that are attributed to evolutionary change, and I'm saying only one of them actually explains speciation. It attempts to, and that's the so-called biological theory, which is the notion that the selection over time for preferable traits. And yet that one is one where we can see no examples of speciation. So I may not be an expert, but I'm relatively well informed. I don't make arguments about things that I'm not prepared to argue.
Wait, so are you saying that you're against the preferable traits speciation?
I'm saying that that's the only one that can potentially explain diversity of species, and that one holds no water. So the other ones can win, and it doesn't do them any good. They have no impact on the flow. Not enough impact on the flow to justify attributing speciation and species differentiation to evolution anyway.
Okay, but then again, I suppose it goes back to my initial question, which is how do you differentiate that from simulation? Because the simulation will still, if you can somehow manage to learn the coding that has the underlying framework of that world or universe or simulation, then you can do all sorts of shit. You can have it if you enter the cheat code. You can pretty much do whatever you want in the game.
Okay.
So
I mean, how can how would we empirically substantiate my claim that? Hold on, just a second, Cam. Um, that I'm not saying that I have no idea in mind as to how to falsify the claim that it's a simulation, and you are correct in saying that's a substantial weakness of it being a claim at all, of being a claim worth making. What I'm saying is not that I'm not actually making that claim. I'm not saying it is a simulation. I'm saying if we had to choose a conclusion based on the data, particularly evolutionary data, we conclude that the evolutionary model, the only one that seems to make any sense, doesn't make any sense, and therefore, given the fact that species had to come from someplace, that we'd be better off making the mistakenly hasty conclusion, which I agree it would be, but if we had to make a hasty conclusion, we'd be better off making the hasty conclusion that it's a simulation than that the status quo evolutionary explanation explains things.
Well, I suppose one argument which I would propose, which many scientists seem to think is childish, but so to me it seems apparent, is consciousness. If consciousness was an attribute of so-called evolution, it would seem apparent that something else other than humans would somehow develop something similar enough at some point. Whether time is a factor or not, it does seem apparent that that would be the case.
Right. We don't see species getting an increasing complexity over time.
Okay, so going back to the definition of the term simulation, a simulation of what?
Of an ecosystem, namely in this case a planet, or a universe, but an ecosystem.
Right, but the only thing that you've got to describe what a planet and a universe is the planet and the universe that we look at now, which is by definition what we
obviously reality is the thing
look at in terms of science.
Yeah, obviously.
And how we
the thing simulated by the reality simulation engine. So
yeah, Castro, I think he just means intentionality.
Yeah, Eric, using the word simulation puts you at a disadvantage.
Why?
Because it implies things.
Okay,
so now
hold on, you said it put me at a disadvantage. So how does it put me at a disadvantage?
Because you have to
put me at a disadvantage.
You're implying that there is another reality that this is a copy of.
Right, I know.
So
that's what I'm trying to imply.
But then you have to substantiate the other reality, which you have no data for. However,
I'm not substantiating that conclusion is true. I'm substantiating that it's preferable to the existing one.
But you can avoid even dealing with that by using a term like generated.
But it's
intentional.
Okay, but if I were to use generated, I'd mean simulated, and I'd rather get right to the implications rather than make somebody do that particular work, because I'm not interested in defending by limiting the scope of my claims. I'm interested in defending my actual claims. And so if in fact it puts me at a disadvantage, well, then it's not the claim I should be making, and I'll learn that by losing.
So what you're doing is you're putting forward what you believe to be inconsistencies with the current understanding about evolution.
And framing it in a more interesting way than simply doing that.
Well, no, that is what you're doing, but yeah.
And framing it in a more interesting way than just doing that is what I said.
Well, for yourself, perhaps. But, it's about comparing one thing to another, and you've got no example of
what?
This other thing which you are believing it to be simulated. What the example of that you are using to say it's a simulation of is the thing itself, which doesn't make any sense.
Well, no, what Jeremy said is correct. It implies that there's another reality that it's mimicking. But of course the thing is, I agree. Obviously, I can't point to an example of such another reality existing, and that's a good argument to say, well, therefore Occam's razor suggests we shouldn't embrace this notion. I'm not saying that we should embrace this notion. I'm saying it makes more sense than the alternative that's currently in common parlance considered the best alternative, the best explanation. So.
Well, yeah, I think the problem is that both have the same problem, which is, well, what's the axiomatic starting point? Is that we don't know. It's like, oh, life happens. Okay, life evolves, but where does life itself stem from? We don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. Obviously, if we're in a simulation, we'd have no means of determining the answer to that question because we're not able to get out of the box to see any actual data.
And that is a good argument. That part of the argument is good because then If something is generated or something is has very strict rules that you can't extrapolate yourself from it, then certain kind of information is limited. We can't perceive the past because we don't have we have temporal limitations. So yeah, that makes sense, and that's a good argument. I would say, yeah,
It's
it
not a good
seems more
argument for anything. It's a good counter.
anti-argument.
It's a good
Yes.
counter to Kestrel's point, but that's it. The thing is,
Yeah.
I want to go back to Kestrel's point about this not being a more interesting frame than just doing it dry. If I were to do a video titled, evolution holes in existing status quo evolutionary theory or something like that, it would get very few views. If I say, does evolution fails prove reality a sim? Question mark exclamation point. It's a lot more likely to get more views. Now, is it actually interesting? I don't know. Obviously, Kestrel's not interested in it. But if I can, I'll determine when people either thumbs up or thumbs down it, or leave comments saying you're an asswipe, Eric, or whatever. And I'm certainly willing to acknowledge that any of those things might be the case. But I also think it's fair to say that the impulse to say, oh, let's frame it in a more catchy way is a good impulse and is not totally off base here.
Yeah, I see your point. Interesting. But then, okay, well, let's go through this really, really ENTJ style. Well, how would you be able to prove a simulation, and how would you be able to? So imagine you had all the data, all the information, all the ideational potentiality. How could you prove either one of the cases, evolution or some simulated reality?
Well,
Could you prove it?
One possible way would be to catch him in the act somehow. Like, be somewhere where somebody playing this game or simulation pops a new species into existence, and all of a sudden, out of thin air, 400,000 of the given species that didn't exist before suddenly appear. If that were to happen, that would be a strong piece of empirics suggesting that it's generated, at least, and lending towards the simulation notion. I see, Jeremy, why you say generated, because you can include God as the agent there, whereas with the simulation, it's less likely to. But it really isn't any different. But I can see why you say generated. You're right. Generated would be a preferable word to use for framing reasons, not because of the implications, which I'm not afraid of handling, but instead because of the utility and the argumentation that you can always backpedal to God with generated. So you're right about that. My mistake.
All the word implies is a generator. That's it.
Right, and
Super
the generator
clean.
can be a sim designer, but it could also just be a god. So
Exactly, it's inclusive.
You're right. That's better because it allows me to backpedal if I wanted to frame back out and go, okay, well then God. But I don't want to backpedal in this instance. I want to argue the sim point. So in this instance, I still kind of stick with my choice. But you're right about your point.
Well, can I ask you a question? So obviously, if you look at Einstein's special and general relativity kind of thing, is time is the perception of time or the flow of time is dependent on the pativa or that thing which is flowing through it. So what I mean is, for example, how could you make a distinction between this reality that we observe right now versus the reality in Eric's mind? So, for example, Eric's mind can create dreams, can create vivid imagery, can create very kind of high level, high abstraction, high imagery level of thought in that mind. Now,
Causation.
those
That's
things.
how. Causation. Causation. That's how.
Okay.
Internal realities are conditional.
But then how could you say that the external reality isn't conditional? Because then if it's a simulator, it will be conditional based on these.
It's not conditional because if I chop my hand off, I can't push undo. I actually no longer have a hand.
But then, okay, fair enough. But then, because it seems apparent that when we do things, there's some kind of action, like every action has an equal and opposite reaction. We do something, something happens, and it can't be taken back. If I break your hand is broken unless you fix it. But that's all dependent on time. So that's only because we have a concept of time. We don't really, if time didn't exist.
You got to factor in two dimensions: metaphysical dimension, which is turn-based and abstract and built of binaries, and the physical dimension, which is causal and concrete. And so the answer is, both.
Interesting. Yeah, because even causal dimension, like something like time and concreteness, that's still dependent on how we can kind of differentiate between. We can make distinctions between objects and distance and time. So metaphysically, you could also create a time reference in your mind. And those things, for example, the person you were 20 years ago is not the same person you are today. And you can't go back to be that person you were before. The sorts of experiences that have manifested in your life have changed you in certain ways that you can't easily become the person you were before. You can emulate it or simulate it, I suppose, but you can't actually be that person. It would take too much energy and it's not consistent. So there would have been some kind. So yeah. So regardless of how you metacognate it, you are a different person today than you were 20 years ago.
One thing
So
you said. Go ahead. Go ahead. Finish your thought.
You go ahead.
Okay. Well, one thing you said that prompted another thought in me is the relativity thing. The fact that time is not a constant, but rather is relative to the observers within the system, makes it also is consistent with the notion of a simulation, because obviously with a massive enough simulation you can no longer, it slows down if it's not, the architecture is not right as it gets bigger and bigger and bigger, right? So the only way to make the architecture such that it doesn't do that is to farm out all of the generation of shit into independent nodes, which are what humans are. Each observer rendering their own the reality independently on their own AI, so to speak, and therefore that absolves the need for somebody to constantly observe the thing into reality, and to observe all the things into reality is no longer necessary. You endow each of the agents within the simulation the power to instantiate by observation, and all of a sudden you no longer have to worry about the processing issue.
Yes. That's interesting. Now, okay, okay, that's interesting. But is there a way to determine the starting point of I suppose being?
A being? Well, I mean, the thing is, if astrophysics is right about the whole expanding contracting thing, then this simulation began whenever they began it, but it began in their world, but it doesn't have a beginning in ours because they set it up to be an infinite loop.
Mm-hmm.
And we'll never be able to know when it started in their world. It was not even meaningless because we're not operating according to their time flow. But that would be, we might in some way, somehow, it's like, in my mind, the game players are like, fuck yeah, one of my sims not only concluded that he's in a sim, but has come up with good substantiation as to why. I told you this intuition thinking thing was going to work. You know, it's like they want their part of the sim to move forward in terms of advancement so that they can get points or something, right? That's how I like. That's my what do you call a little fun thinking. It's not like I actually conclude that. I just think that would be nice if it were like that.
Well, that's interesting. I suppose if they simulate, okay, well, now my mind is now confused because then I'm thinking, okay, fine. Let's say there are generators out there. Now, what generates the generators, and what is the infinite regression?
Well, we can't ever know that because we have no access to any data from that right now. We might eventually be able to if we can get access to data from that realm, but there's no reason to think we could, because if it were a sim, we'd be contained within something in that realm, like a computer or something, and there'd be no. It's a meaningless question to say, well, can something within the computer get out of the computer to see what's outside the computer or something is weird. I don't know what to say about that question.
Yeah, because I mean, even your thoughts, could your thoughts become self-aware and realize, hey, I'm inside Eric's head, without you putting those thoughts inside your thoughts, if that makes sense?
Well, I mean, that's the other thing that kind of lends credence to the notion is that each individual, if they're a sim, they wouldn't really, they'd have something like free will in the sense that they always act out their programming, and there'd have to be randomness built into it, but at the same time, they'd never be able to turn off their AI. So it's like, I never stop ideating, right? Like, almost never. No. It's weird. Why can't I shift gears more effectively? Well, because that's, I'm just a sim.
Yeah.
I'm just acting out
And even,
my particular one. And they have a finite number of different expressions. They have to have it broken down into something like 8 cognitive functions, because otherwise the math gets too complicated.
yeah. It's interesting. I mean, I would agree with you in that way. It's like I have this conditioning of processing that I prefer. Like even in the labs, I always prefer I would prefer any over NI, even though NI would be much more preferable many of the times. And I seem to prefer TI over TE, even though TE would be much more efficient and actually more in a strange way. It would be more systematic for me, because then um, I could actually go and just do the experiments, formulate some kind of rule-based logic from it, and it would be much more useful than just kind of being skeptical about everything and
But you
trying
want
out new shit.
SE though. That's SE you want, not T. T is like
Ah,
learning. Okay, well I need to test this thing, but I've got a problem because how am I going to get these things into here so I can do this experiment? Figuring out the mechanics of shit and stuff like that.
SE.
That's TE. What you want is SE, so you just do all the experiments without feeling impatient with it and wanting to ideate more. I want more SE
Yeah.
too.
And for some reason I can't prefer SE over the other stuff. I could do it sometimes, and it does work for a short time period, but after a while, it almost becomes it becomes draining on my energy.
You're balanced in SE. That's why. It's because like with any, we're enamored of it because it's our nature, and so we never turn it off even when it's appropriate to turn it off. With SE,
Yes.
it's the only one that we're balanced in, and the thing is, we use it when we should use it, and sometimes we don't use it when we should use it because we don't really like it that much. But we're not going to use it badly. We're not going to go rape people or whatever, and
No.
and so it's we're balanced in it. We want more of it because it's one of the more useful of all the functions. It's like being able to follow through and do this shit that you're supposed to do is extremely. It converts to positive outcomes very well. So but ultimately, I really liked Lightbulb's idea, and I've stuck with it that the 8 slot function is the one that we actually use correctly.
Ah, it's interesting. Yeah, it's interesting because it's strange because I'm good at it. I just don't always use it, and it's almost like I can figure out when to use it, especially if it's in a way that may, for example, be useful. But sometimes it's just following through everything. That's where it kind of fails. I don't prioritize everything, and if I did, I would be far more successful technically.
Well, see, this is why
Then-
we start things and don't finish them too. Is because we've got a lot of ideas, and SE works where you stop deliberating and go, fuck it, I'll just do this. So it's why I have a lot of false starts. I this song I made earlier, which was it's not a song at all. It's me just fucking around again. It's called Casserole, right? And it's
Wasn't it named after
what am
Castro?
I going to bring to the potluck? I'm bringing some casserole. What will you bring to the potluck? That's not a good decision. I shouldn't have spent all that time making the casserole song. It's not a good song, really, and I knew I was just joking around. So why did I do that? Well, it's just like it's the nature of SE and being an NE dom. You know you got to do shit, so you go, fuck it, I'll pull the trigger and just start. This is amusing me, I'm going to do it. And I did finish it, but I should have chosen something else to do instead with that time.
I see.
If I'm going to work
Yeah,
on
it's
music,
interesting.
work on something more substantial than that,
Yeah. No, it's definitely interesting because I need to. Well, it's not I need to. Just I almost wished I had a less balanced approach to SE in a way. Is that a cat behind those guys? It is.
Yeah, it's a cat.
Abe is getting some pussy, huh?
Eric, this is Kester. I just want to say I totally agree with you. You're right about the simulation. I'm sold. Well, thanks, Kester. I appreciate you coming around like that. That's big of you.
No problem.
Don't feed the troll, Eric.
Okay, thanks for watching. Don't forget to eat plenty of cheese. Thanks, Kaizo, for contributing as well. And thanks the rest of you for listening.